The bride vanished, her ring still warm in the pew. Welcome to Hallow, I'm your host. Let me know in the comments, where are you joining us from today? Your messages always make this feel like home. Let's begin. It began, as many things do in Oxford, not with a bang nor even a whisper, but with the steady rhythm of water threading through stone. I had walked down toward the Cherwell that morning, not in search of anything particular. The caseload was light, the coffee tepid, and my mood one of dull detachment, but simply to feel the hush of the mist lift slowly over the surface. There are days when the city seems to fold inward, as if unwilling to reveal too much of itself all at once. This was such a morning. Under Magdalen Bridge, the river eddied with quiet insistence, its surface slick with ghostly light, curling itself around my thoughts. A poem came to me then. Not one of Eliot's, though someone at the Times crossword desk had once misattributed it so. The clue had asked for a four-letter word for dusk and hinted wrongly at Ash Wednesday. I remember writing gloam in pencil, lightly, with a small sneer. The line, in truth, was Walter de la Mar's, but we forgive crossword editors their little errors, the way we forgive ghosts for knocking now and then. Near the eastern bank, just beneath a languid droop of willow branches, something pale gleamed from the mud, not white like bone, but a softer brightness, silvery, with a trace of warmth. A ring. I bent slowly, not wanting to disturb the stillness, and plucked it from its resting place. Gold-threaded, but not garish, the sort of piece chosen for sentiment, not ceremony. It had the feel of something recently removed, no scuff from stone, no stain from soil. Strange. It was the sort of object the river usually swallowed without comment. A girl in a rowing jacket, one of those fresh-faced undergraduates who see the river only as a lane to be conquered, had spotted it and waved at me uncertainly. She thought it was a coin. Then she shrugged and pushed off again, blades cutting shallow arcs in the mist. I stood a moment longer. There was the faintest pressure to the air, like a breath being held, but Oxford is always holding its breath. Back at the station, the desk sergeant met me with a glance that suggested something trivial. A woman missing, probably nothing. Likely an overnight affair or a miscommunicated conference. Dr. Elena Greaves, Queen's College, Fellow in Medieval Literature. 36. Described as punctual, quiet, fond of metaphysical poets and long solitary walks. Not married, but recently engaged to a lecturer from Exeter. Her rooms had been unlocked by the porter after she failed to appear for a meeting on Chaucer's lesser-known works. Her bag was still on the desk, coat on the back of the chair, phone charging by the window, but the bed had not been slept in. More curious than troubling. Until the porter mentioned the ring. She always wore it, modest in style, but never absent. It had been a quiet source of envy, he said, among the porters' wives. I said nothing. I slipped a hand into my pocket. The ring felt warmer now, as if it had been waiting to be claimed. Back at Queen's, I asked to see her rooms, a high-ceilinged chamber with a half-read essay on allegory open beside a chipped mug of oolong. There were papers everywhere, but with that deliberate disorder of someone who knew precisely which book concealed the annotated Piers Plowman. No sign of struggle, no carelessly knocked-over chair, no perfume of panic in the air, only the absence, that unmistakable hum where presence used to be. A photograph on her desk, she and a man in tweed by a sundial, each half turned toward the other, as though one had just said something the other wasn't quite sure was funny. His hand on hers. The left one. I watched the porter as he described her again, how she used to hum without realizing it, mostly bird or tallis, a quiet thread between steps. His voice lowered when he mentioned the last time he'd seen her, the night before, leaving the college gate just before 10, walking alone toward the high street. Her expression unreadable. I asked whether she'd seemed distracted. He hesitated, then said yes, and then no. People often do that. Retreat, from certainties. I walked back to the station through Cat Street. The wind had risen a little and the trees were dripping with something like doubt. Later, I placed the ring on the blotter of my desk. I did not label it yet. There was something in the pattern of its discovery, untouched by soil, cradled by a willow, found by a girl who forgot it instantly, that felt less like evidence and more like a whisper. An overture, perhaps. And I have learned, over years and losses, to listen very carefully to overtures. There is something unnerving about rooms that do not quite breathe. Eleanor Greaves's chambers at Queen's were neat, obsessively so, one might say, if one were inclined to distrust order. I have always found that the most meticulously arranged rooms are rarely the calmest. Rather, they're often attempting to hold something in or hold something back. The air was stale with stillness, the kind that comes not from long absence, but from a silence imposed too quickly. There was no clutter, no trail of carelessness, only the sort of precision that suggested departure by design. Except, of course, she had not taken anything with her. A single mug rested by a tall stack of obscure monographs. The tea, if it was tea, had cooled to that peculiar shade between sepia and forgetting. One of the texts lay slightly ajar. A French edition of Le Roman de la Rose, marked with notations as delicate and exacting as surgical incisions. She had underlined a phrase: L'amant se perd toujours un peu en cherchant l'âme de l'autre. The lover always loses himself a little in seeking the soul of the other. It was a quotation chosen not for teaching but for remembering. Above it, an envelope, unsealed, empty, and a scrap of notepaper torn from its companion. Nothing on it but a faint impression where a pen had pressed too softly. I tilted it against the window's light. A curve, a loop, perhaps the tail of a word, but nothing more. The scent in the air was faint, but not unpleasant, not floral, not chemical, something older. My mother had once worn a similar perfume, back when people still dressed for dinner. It lingered now like the breath of a decision. I met with the others in the senior common room, where the whiskey is older than most of the students, and the conversations have learned not to end. A hush filled the space, broken only by the faint chime of a teaspoon on porcelain. 3 of them had agreed to see me. Professor Lionel Haycroft, Dean of the English faculty, looked like a man carved out of old timetables. The sort who remembers when Chaucer was taught in reverent tones, and students still rose when a don entered the room. His handshake was cool and dry, his voice clipped. She was intensely private, dangerously brilliant, he said, as though brilliance were a sort of weapon one ought to handle with gloves. I asked when he had last seen her. He seemed to calculate it, rather than recall it. Wednesday, he said. A committee meeting on postgraduate assessments. She'd contributed very little, looked pale, distracted perhaps. I asked if that was unusual. She could be unpredictable, he said, intellectually restless, not always easy. The tone was one I recognized, a mixture of admiration and grievance, like someone recalling a prodigy who refused to play by the rules of the performance. Beneath it, a faint residue of something else. Jealousy, perhaps, or loss. Beside him sat Judith Blythe, fellow in Renaissance studies, eyes like glass, struck sharp. She had the look of someone who had outlived too many wrong turns. She played at passion, Judith said, lifting her cup without sipping. It was her subject, after all. Courtly love, literary seduction. She enjoyed the theatre of it. Did you get along? She smiled without warmth. I respected her mind. She demanded that, and her heart. It wasn't something she offered. I left that hanging. Some truths arrive more clearly when unchased. Later, I found Adam Foyle pacing by the chapel cloisters, a young man who seemed to have stepped out of his own biography too soon. His collar was open, his shoes overly polished. Ambition clung to him like cologne. He said he'd last seen Elena the night before, just before evensong. She seemed distracted, he murmured, not quite meeting my gaze. Said she had something to finish. I asked what, but she didn't answer. He hesitated, then added, as if correcting a memory already softening. I offered to walk her back, but she declined. Said the air would help her think. Did that worry you? A little. But she often needed space. She wasn't needy, I asked, about their engagement. He nodded too quickly. Yes. It was recent, just a few weeks. She said yes, after a lecture on Boethius. I thought it meant something. Her bicycle's still here, I said. That startled him. It is? Still chained by the gate. He looked away, the way people do when they realize something quiet has just shifted in meaning. As I left the cloisters, the chapel bell began to toll. Not the hour, but a call to reflection. I paused a moment beneath the archway. The mist had lifted, but the sky remained undecided. I glanced at the bicycle. Dust on the saddle. Dampness in the chain links, the sort of detail no one notices until it becomes the only thing left. She had not planned to be gone long, or not at all. And yet she had vanished, not in defiance of logic, but perhaps in pursuit of something it could never hold. They found her 2 miles downstream, where the Isis slows beneath the old boathouse pylons and the water begins to forget its shape. It was a rower again, a different girl this time, young, breathless, the edge of her oar nicking the surface just enough to disturb what the river had tried to hide. Lodged beneath a barge mooring, half covered by reeds and river silt, lay Elena Greaves. Still pale, strangely unmarked. No bruising, no struggle, no gasp of air denied. The coroner, a man who'd seen too many endings and too few explanations, spoke softly when he handed me the preliminary notes. Internal hemorrhaging, clean, undisturbed, likely a fast-acting toxin. There were no cuts, no broken capillaries, no lung water. She had not drowned. The river merely cradled her after death, as though reluctant to give her back. I studied the page long after I understood it. She had died in the early hours, the coroner said. Between 4 and 5, when the lamplight dims and even the bells seem hesitant. Not the evening before, as Adam Foyle had claimed, not after evensong, not before her solitary walk, but long after, in the dark hush of morning. Strange was the one who pointed out the initials. We were in my office. I'd finally opened the ring. Not placed it in evidence, just held it a while longer. Turned it slowly in the light. The inscription was small, almost private. Still warm? A.F. Strange peered over my shoulder. That your fellow from Exeter? I nodded. Adam Foyle, the signature of a man who believed himself chosen. Strange said something else, something about sentimentality in modern men always making him nervous. But I wasn't listening by then. My thoughts were drifting, quietly, back toward her desk, that faint, unsettled thing about the mug. Half drunk, yes, but the tea had gone tepid in the wrong way, not just cold, but long forgotten, a layer of faint scum at the top, as though it had sat untouched for hours. And she had always, I was told, finished her tea while reading. So if the mug had not been touched since early evening, yet her death came closer to dawn, then what had filled the hours in between? The post-mortem showed nothing on her skin. No puncture marks, no abrasions in the mouth, no sign of vomiting or resistance. Just the internal rupture, the slow collapse of something vital. A death that arrived gently. Or so it would seem. I held the file as one might hold a photograph, gently, with the feeling that the image might change if stared at long enough. I began to look more closely, more slowly, at those around her. Adam Foyle first, the fiancé who spoke in declarations. He had seemed confident in his timeline, but too many of his statements had the sound of memory rehearsed, not recalled. I reread my notes. She needed space. She declined the walk back. She was distant, and yet her bicycle remained, her coat remained, her body somehow left the college unseen, only to surface later where the river bends out of sight. Judith Blythe next. Her remark lingered. She played at passion, the sort of thing you say when you think someone has cheated you out of honesty or love. Professor Haycroft's words too rang oddly now, dangerously brilliant. Not brilliant in the sense of genius, but dangerous in the way that brilliance unsettles the careful hierarchies of men who've long claimed wisdom as inheritance. Each of them had offered their view of her: poet, scholar, seductress, enigma. And yet not one had truly known her. Only the echo of her role in their narrative. And what role did I play? It was a question I preferred not to answer. That night I returned to the river, not to investigate, but to listen. The Isis does not lie, not the way people do. It simply carries what it is given: stones, secrets, silver rings. It remembers only through movement. I stood where she'd last been seen whole, near the willow where I found the ring. The air was still, the water unremarkable. And yet something in me shifted. A question, quiet but insistent. Why leave the ring behind? If it had fallen, it would have sunk. If removed in anger, it would have been thrown farther. But it had rested there, warm, dry, waiting, placed, not lost, which meant a message, not to the world, but to someone who would understand. I walked back slowly, the night air carrying the faint scent of rain and riverweed. I did not sleep. Instead, I opened her books, the ones she'd annotated, and began again. Not for clues, but for her, the lines she loved, the margins she'd filled. Somewhere in those pages, I believed, was a sentence that would not quite fit, a phrase just slightly off, a word pressed too hard into paper, something trying to be heard. Tenure at Queen's is not so much earned as endured. It is a process bound in custom, not kindness. A ladder climbed slowly by those willing to wait in silence, which is why it struck me as odd when I found Elena Greaves had bypassed the usual procession of committees, votes, and veiled backroom verdicts. Her fellowship had been extended early, quietly, and without the necessary turbulence. The minutes were sparse. The decision, however, had been endorsed by Professor Haycroft himself. That surprised me. Haycroft was not known for generosity, nor for haste. His reputation, carefully cultivated over decades, was that of a man who trusted only what he could annotate. For him to accelerate a post, especially for someone like Elena, whose methods were admired but whose manner was not, suggested something more than admiration. The paper trail was slight, but I found it in the bursary files, a single-page memo signed in Haycroft's meticulous, embattled hand. No rationale, just a signature. That same afternoon, I returned to Elena's rooms. The college had not yet rekeyed them. I moved slowly, letting the silence gather around me like smoke. In her waste bin, a small wire basket beside the desk, lay the charred remains of a letter, partly burned, but not carefully. The top corner remained, still clinging to shape. The rest crumbled with the lightest breath. The writing was cramped, desperate. Ink pressed too hard into the page. What remained read, "You taught me to see, then turned your gaze away. You made me think it meant something. I am not whole without..." No name at the top, no signature. But there was a return address on the envelope, half-seared but legible enough. D. Reeve, Cowley. Dominic Reeve, a former student of hers, now an obscure poet if the dust jacket blurbs were to be believed. A single volume to his name, published privately, and reviewed only in the margins of magazines that smelled of damp paper and cigarette ash. I made a note of it, then paused. Why burn it incompletely? Elena had not been careless. She'd finished her tea with precision. She had chosen her books like confidants. Yet the letter remained half alive in her waste bin, as though discarded in haste or doubt. A message meant to disappear, but not entirely. I walked back through First Quad and found Judith Blythe in the cloister garden, pruning something already dead. I asked about Reeve. She did not flinch. Dominic. Yes. She was fond of him once. He was clever, if overwrought. Thought every sonnet he wrote should echo through eternity. Elena was his sun, or his eclipse. I forget which. You disapproved? I disapprove of sentiment, she said, brushing a stem from her lapel, especially when it masquerades as scholarship. She paused, as if remembering a tune she'd tried to forget. Elena had a talent for what I call academic enchantment. She knew how to choose a protégé, make them feel seen, special, desired even, but once their usefulness ended, once they fell in love or demanded too much, she withdrew. Gently, but completely. It was always the same. And Reeve? She sighed, didn't take it well. He wrote poems instead of moving on. I suspect he thought heartbreak was the final stage of the tutorial. It was not sarcasm, not quite. There was something older in her voice, resentment perhaps, or regret. Later, I visited Adam Foyle at his flat off Banbury Road, one of those sterile, too silent places that smells faintly of aftershave and ambition. He welcomed me with a touch too much brightness, as if rehearsing composure. He said he'd spent the night alone, working on a book proposal, something about intellectual seduction in medieval texts. He offered me coffee. I declined. The flat was neat, almost obsessively so, like Elena's rooms. But there was a difference. Her order was lived in, his felt curated. I looked at the bookshelf, a shrine to scholarship, volumes of theory lined perfectly, spines uncreased, pages virginal, but one book stood out, the Ars Amatoria, Ovid's Manual of Love and Manipulation. It was dog-eared, worn. I pulled it down. He tensed. Inside, a flurry of marginalia by tight, looping script I'd seen before. Elena's handwriting, desire as translation she'd scrawled beside one passage. Who owns the metaphor? Further in, a line underlined twice, she who yields conquers. I closed the book, gently. Adam looked away. She gave this to you? He nodded, too slowly. Yes, as a gift. She liked the irony. Of course. I left him in silence, the book still open on the table. Outside, the clouds hung low, as if waiting for something to fall. Elena had surrounded herself with cleverness, lovers, students, colleagues. But cleverness alone does not kill. It was affection, I now suspected, that had turned. Or its shadow, the moment when admiration darkens into something more possessive, more perilous. And in that turning, something had been broken. I began quietly to read Reeve's poetry. Not for beauty, but for blame. The chapel at Queen's was half lit, as if unsure whether to invite the morning in or hold the darkness a little longer. I sat alone at the back, not out of reverence, but because I was tired of desks and certainty. The choir had begun to rehearse, a setting of the Song of Songs, voices rising like slow incense into the timbered rafters. Set me as a seal upon thine heart, for love is strong as death. It was always the same with these texts, too old for irony, too beautiful to dismiss. There is something about sacred music sung by untrained voices that makes truth feel both accidental and absolute. I closed my eyes. Somewhere in Elena's notebooks I had found a scribble beside a Latin verse. Love, like Latin, is only dangerous when mispronounced. It had made me smile then, though now I wasn't sure if she'd meant it as a warning or a confession. When I returned to her staircase, the cleaner, Mrs. Darcy, sharp-eyed despite her softness, was dusting the banister with a kind of distracted care. She asked me, cautiously, if I believed Doctor. Greaves had meant to disappear. I said no. She nodded, then hesitated, cloth held still in her hand. There was a man, she said, one night last week, late, after 10, waiting outside her rooms. Not the young one, not the smooth one, she clarified, with the tie that never quite sits right, but someone older, in a long coat, grey, standing very still, holding something under his arm, like a box or a parcel. She didn't see his face, only the shape of him, unmoving. He stood there a long time, she added. Then he left. She hadn't reported it. thought it might have been a visiting don or someone shy. But there had been something about his stillness, something watchful. I thanked her and left slowly. The air in the quad had begun to sharpen, autumn creeping inward. Back in the porter's lodge, I asked to see the guest book. It was an old tradition, still observed more out of inertia than utility. Visitors asked to sign in, though most didn't. Still a few pages from the night Elena vanished, a name had been scrawled in a tall, angular hand. E. Coleridge. The signature was too deliberate, like someone trying to write what they imagined a name should look like. I copied it. Back at the station, I pulled out Reeves' poetry collection, Rehearsals of Love, a slim, self-consciously tragic volume printed on paper that felt too heavy for the weight of its words. But the dedication page, that was where I found it. The same hand, angled, leaning forward slightly, the tail of the G in longing looped just so. The signature was not Coleridge's, it was Reeves'. He had been in Oxford that night. He had stood outside Elena's rooms with a parcel in his arms and a name not his own. I said nothing of this to Strange. Not yet. I wasn't ready for the noise of it. Instead, I sat with the book open on my lap and let the verse do what it wanted. She taught me the music of refusal Reeve had written, and I sang it back in silence. His poems were not good, but they were honest in a way that frightened me. Not because of what they revealed, but because of what they concealed with tenderness. I imagined him there, beneath Elena's window, holding something wrapped in the manner of a gift or a plea, hoping perhaps that the mere act of waiting might restore what had been taken from him, or refused. And Elena, behind the curtains or elsewhere entirely, unaware or unwilling or simply done. I knew that kind of silence, the kind born not of cruelty but fatigue, the kind that feels like self-preservation until it begins to echo. Haycroft? He fit the age, the coat, but not the false name. Haycroft would have used his own name and expected to be thanked for the intrusion. Reeve, though, the name borrowed from a poet, that was a man trying to remain unseen while imagining himself tragic. And the parcel? That remained the one detail that did not fit. Unless, of course, it was meant not as offering, but as answer. A poison fits in a parcel. So does a poem. So does a bottle with nothing written on the label. I set the guest book beside the Reeve volume and looked again at the handwriting. Identical. Certain. And yet, something still hesitated inside me. A reluctance to move the pieces too quickly. There is a danger, I've found, in being right too soon. It hardens the mind before the truth is ready to appear. I went back to the college that evening, just as evensong ended, the choir still echoing faintly behind the chapel doors. I walked past Elena's window, pausing at the stairs. The air was dry now, the leaves beginning to fall. I imagined her once more at her desk, pen in hand, mug cooling beside her. The silence before death, or the quiet rehearsal of a goodbye she never gave. And I began, at last, to wonder. Had she known he was there? Had she let him in? Or had she simply listened behind the door while love, mispronounced, tried once more to speak? I met Dominic Reeve at a quiet tea shop just off Cowley Road, a place where the cutlery still rattles faintly against the saucers and the windows mist from their own loneliness. He arrived early, looking like a man who had spent the last few nights arguing with his own poems. His coat was too thin, his eyes too bright. He admitted it at once, almost with relief. Yes, he'd been in Oxford. Yes, he'd stood outside her door. Yes, the name in the book was his invention. No, he hadn't meant to deceive, not really, just to avoid questions. He told me he had come with a gift, her father's old copy of Troilus and Criseyde. She had lent it to him in better days. A battered volume, margins thick with annotations, some her father's, some her own, occasionally layered like sediment, from a shared obsession. She loved the tragic parts, he said, the longing before the loss. I think she believed that was the only honest kind of love. I asked what happened when she opened the door. She seemed wrong, he said. Not surprised exactly, but unsettled. She took the book like it had burned her. Said thank you, quietly. Then nothing. She mentioned Adam. Said she was ending it. Said it too quickly as though rehearsed, and then she stopped speaking. Just stared past me. I asked if she wanted me to go, and she didn't answer. But I knew. Did you go? Of course. I left the way I came. She never even closed the door. He said all this without deflection, without the performance of innocence. His voice wavered once when he spoke her name. I let him go, not because I believed he was incapable of harm, but because what he carried was already punishment enough. Later I returned to the Bodleian. I had asked the archivist about recent readers of the special collection, those shadowed corners where the oldest pages live behind glass and breathless gloves. Elena had been there 3 weeks before she vanished, reading a medieval poem so obscure it doesn't appear in most curricula. Amoris submersio, the archivist told me. A short love poem written in Middle English, known for a single manuscript copy and a gloss in the margin that no one had yet translated fully. She had spent nearly 4 hours with it. I asked to see it. The poem was small, less than 100 lines, but the marginalia, written in a curling, uncertain Latin hand, caught my eye. I read it slowly. A scholar's voice emerged, distant and resigned. Etiam callida, annulus in flumen perditur. Even still warm, the ring is lost in the river. The phrase turned slowly in my mind, like a coin rolling to stillness. A metaphor, certainly, but also a warning, perhaps even a confession. Was this what Elena had been reading the week she made her decision? Had she found herself in the echo of those lines, a woman who knew passion, but no longer safety? Had she decided the ring, Adam's ring, was something that must be returned to water? Or was it a message to someone else? The detail haunted me. She had marked no pages, requested no facsimiles, left no notes. But the archivist had mentioned something else. She was not alone, he said. A man met her after. Tall, older, academic perhaps. He didn't give a name. Haycroft? I thought of his signature on her early tenure, of his tight mouth when he spoke of her brilliance, of the way older men sometimes mistake admiration for possession and feel betrayed when the gift of their approval is not clung to. That evening, I walked again by the Cherwell, where the water forgets everything too quickly. I tried to imagine the moments, Elena reading the gloss, Elena returning the ring, Elena silent before Reeve. She had not written a farewell, had not called for help. She had simply slipped softly into the logic of her own conclusion. Even still warm, the ring is lost. She had given Adam his answer in silence, given Reeve a book in return for a wound, and given the river what it had always been meant to carry. But it was the poem that lingered. That marginal gloss, barely legible, barely surviving, passed from hand to hand through the centuries until it reached her. And now, me. I wondered who else had read it, who else had understood or mispronounced it. I stood on the footbridge until the dark thickened around the river and the lights of Queen's flickered faintly behind the trees. Some truths don't settle, they circle, like water, like music, like love, especially when spoken in a tongue too old to forgive. It was Judith Blythe who told me. Not eagerly, not with satisfaction, but with the flat grace of someone who has waited too long to be believed. She asked me to sit, which she'd never done before, and poured tea that neither of us touched. Elena had planned to withdraw her support for Adam's research grant, she said, setting her hands neatly on her lap. She hadn't told the board yet, but she'd made her decision. Why? Judith looked down at the tablecloth as if reading something faint written in the weave. She said he was borrowing brilliance. That was her phrase. I thought at first she meant flattery, but no, she meant theft. Ideas, phrases, whole scaffolds of thought. Plagiarism? Judith nodded. Elena said it wasn't just lazy, it was dangerous. Especially coming from someone like Adam, who knew how to disguise it. She'd found notes in his proposal that matched her own lectures, unpublished ones. She paused, then added, almost gently, she was going to expose him, quietly if possible, but firmly. I left the college with that phrase in my pocket, borrowing brilliance. At the station, I asked for Adam's proposal, the final version. It arrived in a plastic folder too clean for something that claimed to be intellectual labor. I read it slowly, every line. And there it was. On page 7, in a paragraph meant to be a passing aside, desire, in medieval texts, is not possession, but echo. It moves antiphonally, through mirrored gestures of refusal and return. The word struck me antiphonally. I remembered it from Elena's notes, which I had skimmed during a long, dry hour in the evidence room. The phrase was hers, precisely hers, in margin, in ink, in thought, not published, not cited. I summoned Adam the next morning. He arrived looking rehearsed. Crisp shirt, polished shoes, a look that said, I've done nothing wrong, and if I had, I would have done it better. I asked him about the grant. He feigned surprise, then wounded confusion. Elena supported it. She encouraged it. It was her idea, in fact, that I focus on echo structures in courtly lyric. She was thrilled by it. You used the term antiphonally, I said, quietly. In your proposal. He blinked. I meant responsive. That's the simpler term, same idea. It isn't the same idea, I said. One is musical, liturgical. The other is transactional. And you know the difference. He flushed, just a shade too slow. You're reading too much into phrasing, Inspector. Academics speak in borrowed language. It's how we build things. I smiled without moving my mouth. And what about Elena's unpublished notes? He faltered. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do. You lifted that line, word for word. He stood then, not in anger, but in that careful, theatrical rage that young men use when they still believe truth is a matter of performance. She would have understood, he said. We were building something together. No, I said, you were standing on her. He sat again, this time quieter. I waited, watched, and then I took the ring from my pocket. The silver one, gold-threaded, inscribed on the inside with a private ache, and placed it on the table between us. I didn't speak. He didn't reach for it. He only looked, and kept looking. It was too long. I've seen guilt in many forms, laughter, silence, sweat. But there's a particular kind that reveals itself in stillness. The kind that can't look away because it recognizes itself. Finally, he spoke, voice low. She took it off. Did she? Yes, that night. Said it no longer meant what it had. Left it on the windowsill. But the ring had not been found on a windowsill. It had been found beneath a willow, clean and dry, placed, not dropped. Why did you keep it? He didn't answer. And why bring it back? Still nothing. I leaned forward. She was going to end your grant, expose you. You knew that. His mouth opened, then closed. Words shifted behind his eyes, but none made it out. You saw your future coming apart, didn't you? The praise, the paper trail, the ladder. You couldn't bear that it was hers. At last, his voice, thin, as though pulled through gauze. She said I was nothing without her. And were you? He looked at the ring once more. And this time, when he blinked, I saw water in his eyes, but not the right kind. He had mistaken possession for devotion, echo for origin. And Elena Greaves, clever to the end, had known that the most cutting line would not be spoken. It would be placed, quietly, in a river. Even still warm, the ring is lost. I left him alone with it. Some truths do not need confession, only silence. The lab report arrived folded in three, as though discretion might soften what it had to say. The cause of Elena's death was now certain, not violence, not despair, but a rare alkaloid derived from Datura stramonium, sometimes called thorn apple, sometimes devil's trumpet, depending on whether you feared it or studied it. It was found in trace amounts at the base of her mug, disguised in the residue of what had once been chamomile or something like it. A quiet poison, almost undetectable unless you were looking. I was looking now. Datura is a curious thing, not quick, not always fatal, but potent in its ambiguity, inducing hallucination, disorientation, soft internal collapse, a toxin that kills slowly and without theatre, the kind of death a poet might imagine if the poet had grown tired of metaphor. I walked again through the department, its quiet corridors and polite doors. The shared kitchen sat at the back, narrow, windowless, always faintly damp. Shelves of mismatched jars, brown glass and old tins. Tea, sugar, instant soup. Only one person, I was told, brought their own herbal blends. Adam Foyle. A reputation for it, in fact. Insisted on the clarity of thought it provided. One jar in particular, a large, dark one, was missing its label. No one knew what had been in it. I didn't need to test it. Not yet. I simply asked questions. A lab assistant, second year, uncertain whether she was afraid of me or of her own memory, confessed that Adam had once asked her, casually, what she knew about natural sedatives. Said he was writing a character who used one. For a short story, he said. Wanted something that wouldn't leave a trace. She hadn't thought much of it. People asked stranger things in Oxford, but now the words hung differently in the air, like spores. I thanked her. She did not smile. Back at the station, I returned to the ring. I'd looked at it a dozen times, but now the inscription felt sharper. Still warm. I had assumed it was Adam's phrase, a lover's flourish, but it wasn't. It was Elena's, buried in one of her old lectures. I remembered now, a passing reference to Keats. The moment between touch and absence, she had said, is everything. The hand still warm where another once lay. It was from a letter, I believe, one of his final ones. But she had paraphrased it in her diaries, again and again. It was her private way of marking loss, not the absence itself, but the echo of heat just before it fades. Adam, I was certain, would never have known that. He didn't read poetry unless it had footnotes and job prospects. So how did he come to inscribe the phrase? I returned to her rooms. The books still lined the walls. The scent still lingered. Aged paper, dried mint, something almost lavender. But something else was gone. Her diaries. I hadn't noticed it at first. Who would? They're not always meant to be seen. But Judith had once mentioned them, offhandedly. Dozens of them. Small black notebooks she filled each year, kept in a shoebox under her bed. She wrote in them with ritual, never for publication, just for thought. They were no longer there, not in drawers, not in boxes, not beneath the floorboard where I once found a student's unsigned essay on betrayal in The Knight's Tale. Gone. I called Adam's college. He wasn't in, gone to London, they said, a seminar, something on medieval semiotics, which is what people say when they want to make absence sound impressive. I waited until dusk. There is a stillness in Oxford at dusk that presses the world flat, as though the stone itself is holding its breath. I sat on a bench outside Queen's, just beneath the lamp that flickers once before surrendering to dark. I thought of the phrase. Still warm, not romantic, not nostalgic, just precise. The exact description of a moment where something has gone but not yet vanished. The warmth left behind like a warning. Elena had placed the ring by the river. She had taken it off knowing it would be found. She was sending someone a message. but the wrong person had read it. Adam had found her diaries, read what was never meant for him, learned her language not to understand but to imitate. He had borrowed her words as he had borrowed her thoughts. But words, like poisons, have their own memory. And I could feel the case settling, not in satisfaction but in sorrow. Because this was never about rage or jealousy, not entirely. It was about theft, of ideas, of voice, of self, the quietest kind of murder. And she, in her last act, had left behind a single sentence, half kept, half lost, that only someone who truly knew her would ever hear correctly. I stood then. The bell from Magdalen sounded once, low and hollow, and I knew what I had to do. It was Sunday, and I had not meant to read the crossword. The Observer lay open on my desk, half hidden beneath a stack of case notes I wasn't yet ready to reread. The clues were mostly tedious that week, too proud of their own cleverness, until one caught me like a whisper through a closed door. Poisoned gift wrapped in love's guise 5. I stared at it longer than it deserved. The answer, when it came, was soft and brutal all at once. Bloom, a flowering, a gift, a gesture. And, in some corners of literature, a quiet threat, datura, for instance, or belladonna, or foxglove, all lovely, all fatal. I recalled then Elena's long-ago paper, a lecture I had once overheard her deliver with disarming calm to a room of half-asleep classicists, poisonous blooms, metaphor and malice in Chaucer, a study of how gifts, especially floral ones, are often the weapons of the genteel. I asked for a copy from her department files. It arrived in a manila envelope, lightly creased at the edges. The title page bore her neat hand. The footnotes, as always, were precise and unforgiving, but there was a page missing, page 6, torn out cleanly, not mislaid, but extracted. I remembered the book in Adam's flat, the Ars Amatoria, still dog-eared, still resting where I had left it. I called in a favour, and the keys arrived before dusk. The flat was empty. Not just of him, but of music, of warmth, of any residual thought. Still the book remained, exactly where I knew it would be. Inside, tucked between 2 annotated leaves, was the missing page, folded once, smoothed flat, her handwriting in blue ink, but another hand in black had entered the conversation. Thinner, more anxious, as though trying to keep up with her thought and falling short with every word. One correction caught my eye. In a paragraph exploring Chaucer's use of gentilesse, nobility as inherited versus nobility as performed, Adam had scrawled a note in the margin. Innate goodness always trumps social rank. But that was wrong. Elena's argument, subtle and rooted in the Middle English, suggested the opposite, that social gestures create the illusion of inner virtue, that poison often wears the guise of a gift, a bloom, a ring, a promise. It was a misreading, a fundamental one. And worse, it was not hers. It was his, and he had written it over her work. He had taken what shimmered and dulled it in his hands. The paper, annotated in 2 voices, had become a confession, not of guilt, not overtly, but of fear. The kind of fear that seizes men who know their brilliance is borrowed, who feel their scaffolding begin to sway. She had confronted him, or she was going to. Her tenure secured, her voice growing louder. He must have seen it coming, the quiet collapse of his borrowed career. And so he brewed her tea, no drama, no blood, just a bloom dissolved in warmth, a gift masked as care. And afterward, and when her silence became irrevocable, he staged a scene. The ring, placed by the river as if Juliet had wandered into Oxford and decided to rewrite her ending. A performance for those who still believe tragedy has to rhyme. But Elena had written the truth before she died, not in letters, not in cries for help, but in margins, in footnotes, in arguments, so carefully constructed that only a thief would fail to notice the weight of what he carried. Even the ring, still warm, was no romantic flourish. It was a citation, a borrowed line from Keats, one he misunderstood and misused. He had tried to mimic her language, but like a poor scholar, he had chosen gloss over grammar. The next morning, I summoned him. He arrived composed, that same faint cologne, the jacket too clean, the shoes uncreased. I said nothing at first, only opened the book and slid it across the table, the page with both their hands. He glanced at it, and something flickered. Not recognition, but dread. You copied her, I said softly. You rewrote her thought and called it your own, but you couldn't quite hold it. He opened his mouth, closed it. You read her diaries. You used her phrases. You brewed her tea. His hands folded on the table, then unfolded. You planted the ring, to make it look like something else. His voice, when it came, was flat. She wasn't going to stop. No, I said, she was going to be heard. And now she had been, not in courts, not in headlines, but here in the silence that followed, where a footnote, misread, became a verdict. It was late when I asked Adam to come, not to the station but to my rooms, a concession perhaps to the part of me that still believed confession when it comes should be offered in private, like prayer. He arrived without coat, the collar of his shirt already wilted, his eyes a little too alert. I poured 2 fingers of scotch into the glasses, the good kind, not out of kindness, but for the weight it carries when silence needs softening. He sat across from me, knees angled away, a scholar still trying to present a profile. I laid the page down first, Eleanor's, annotated in 2 hands, his correction, his misreading. He didn't touch it. Next, the printout from the lab, the datura in her mug, the residue, the botanical specificity. Still nothing, then the ring. I didn't place it between us this time. I held it, a small silver memory threaded in gold, inscribed with a line, not his. He watched it like a man watches a verdict he already knows by heart. I said her name once. He flinched, and then, very gently, I said the only thing left to say. You didn't mean to kill her? The words hung, they neither accused nor forgave. He exhaled, slow and sharp, and the edges of his anger began to show, not as regret, but as disappointment. In her, in himself. In the fragile scaffolding of genius he had built atop borrowed bricks. She was going to ruin everything, he said, almost to himself. The grant, the lectures, the interviews. I had momentum. Do you know how hard that is to get? One wrong word from her and I'm back to empty seminar rooms and marking essays on Lydgate. So you brewed her tea, just enough to make her ill, to throw things off. I thought she'd sleep, miss her meeting, delay things. I didn't calculate the dose. It was just leaves, just bloom. His voice cracked, but not from guilt. From the sudden collapse of the illusion that he was clever enough to control how far malice reaches. She left the room, I said. Yes. And you followed? Number. I panicked. I waited. I thought she'd lie down, but when I checked later, she was gone. I thought she was hiding or playing some game. I went back. I wrote. I convinced myself it hadn't happened, but it had. Elena had staggered from her room, mind fogged, heart slipping out of rhythm, and walked, or drifted, toward the one place in Oxford where silence always seems deliberate. The river, the Cherwell, cold and forgiving. She'd collapsed there, under the watch of no one. The ring, perhaps loosened by the swell in her fingers, had slipped from her hand. She died alone, not quickly, but quietly, still warm. He looked at me then, really looked, and said something I'll never forget. She made me think I was extraordinary. You weren't, I said. He left without being led away. There would be formalities, of course, reports, charges, the slow machinery of institutional grief, but those would arrive later. That night I returned the ring to the college safe. Not because it belonged there. It didn't. But because it was the only place left where silence still had meaning. It rested in the velvet like something holy, or cursed, or both. Outside, the moon had folded itself into the mist, and I walked again along the Cherwell. The water, as always, kept moving, impervious to memory, uninterested in consequence. 1,000 stories had ended here, some quietly, some with ripples. The river recorded none of them. I thought not of justice. That word felt too large, too loud. This had not been a story of justice, nor of love. It had been a story of misunderstanding, of lines misread, poems misquoted, intentions diluted until only bitterness remained. Elena Greaves had been brilliant, difficult, precise, and in the end, unfinished. Not for lack of clarity, but because her ending arrived too soon for anyone to write the footnote. The ring had not been planted, it had fallen, from fingers that still held warmth. A final gesture, not toward tragedy, but truth. I stopped where I had found it first, beneath the willow, its roots still dipping like questions into the shallows. And for a long time I listened, but the river, as ever, said nothing. It has always been good at keeping secrets.